There are some differences between his version and Zhukov's. For example, Zhukov did not mention Montgomery's drive on Berlin, while Konev makes no reference to a proposed Anglo-American airborne drop on the city. The source material for the report read by General Shtamenko has never been revealed. In the author's judgment, it was a grossly exaggerated military evaluation of Eisenhower's message from the night before, an evaluation based partly on suspicion of Eisenhower's motives, partly as a concoction intended to furnish a rationale for Stalin's own aims. Colonel General Heinrich's car moved slowly through the rubble of Berlin, making for the Reichskanzlei and the full-dress meeting ordered by Hitler 9 days earlier. Sitting in the back alongside his operations chief, Colonel Eismann, Heinrichi stared silently out at the burned and blackened streets. In 2 years he had made only one other trip to the city. Now the evidence of his own eyes overwhelmed him. He would never have recognized the place as Berlin. In normal times, the trip from his headquarters to the Reichskanzlei would have taken about 90 minutes, but they had been en route nearly twice that long. Again and again, clogged streets forced them to make complicated detours. Even main thoroughfares were often impassable. Elsewhere, crazily canted buildings threatened to collapse at any moment, making every street a danger. Water gushed and gurgled from immense bomb holes. Escaping gas flared from ruptured mains, and all over the city areas were cordoned off and marked with signs that warned "Achtung, Minen!" signifying the location of still unexploded aerial mines. Heinrichi, his voice bitter, said to Eismann, "So this is what we've finally come to, a sea of rubble." Although buildings on both sides of the Wilhelmstrasse were in ruins, apart from some splinter damage, nothing about the Reichskanzlei appeared to have changed. Even the faultlessly dressed SS sentries just outside the entrance seemed the same. They snapped smartly to attention as Heinrichi, Eismann behind him, entered the building. Despite the delays, the general was on time. The conference with Hitler was scheduled for 3 p.m., and Heinrichi had given it much thought over the past few days. As bluntly and precisely as possible, he intended to tell Hitler and those around him the true facts of the situation confronting the army group Vistula. Heinrichi knew perfectly well the danger of speaking out, but the possible consequences did not seem to bother him. Eismann, on the other hand, was greatly disturbed. "It looked to me," he later said, "as if Heinrichi was planning an all-out attack against Hitler and his advisers, and there were very few men who could do that and survive." In the main hall, an SS officer, immaculate in a white tunic, black breeches, and highly polished cavalry boots, greeted Heinrichi and informed him that the meeting would take place in the Führer bunker. Heinrichi had heard that a vast labyrinth of underground installations existed beneath the chancellery, the adjoining buildings, and the enclosed gardens at the back, but he had never before been in any of them. Following a guide, he and Eismann walked down to the basement and out into the gardens. Though the facade of the Reichskanzlei was intact, the rear of the building showed severe damage. Once, magnificent gardens with a complex of fountains had been here. They were gone now, along with Hitler's tea pavilion and the botanical greenhouses that had stood to one side of it. To Heinrichi, the area resembled a battlefield, with huge craters, lumps of concrete, smashed statuary, and uprooted trees. In the soot-stained walls of the chancellery were great black holes where windows used to be. Eismann, looking at the desolation, was reminded of a line from The Singer's Curse by the 19th century German balladeer Uhland. It went, "Only one high column tells of the vanished glory. This one can fall overnight." Heinrichi was more literal-minded. "Just think," he murmured to Eismann. 3 years ago Hitler had Europe under his command, from the Volga to the Atlantic. Now he's sitting in a hole under the earth. They crossed the garden to an oblong blockhouse guarded by 2 sentries. Their credentials were examined, and then the guards opened a heavy steel door, allowing the officers to pass through. As the door clanged shut behind them, Heinrichi was always to remember, "We stepped into an unbelievable underworld." At the bottom of a winding concrete staircase, two young SS officers received them in a brilliantly lighted foyer. Courteously, their coats were taken, and then, with equal courtesy, Heinrici and Eismann were searched. Eismann's briefcase in particular received attention. It had been a briefcase containing explosives that had nearly ended Hitler's life in July 1944. Since then, the Führer's elite guards had allowed no one near him without first subjecting them to a search. Heinrici, despite the apologies of the SS men, seethed at the indignity. Eismann felt ashamed that a German general should be treated in this manner. The search over, they were shown into a long, narrow corridor, partitioned into two sections, the first of which had been converted into a comfortable lounge. Domed lights protruded from the ceiling, giving the light beige stucco walls a yellowish cast. An oriental carpet on the floor had apparently been brought down from a larger chancellery room, for its edges were folded under at each side. Although the room was comfortable, the furniture, like the carpet, seemed out of keeping. There were various chairs, some plain, some covered in rich upholstery. A narrow oak table was set against one wall, and several large oil paintings, landscapes by the German architect and painter Schinkel, were hung about the room. To the right of the entrance, an open door gave onto a small conference room set up for the meeting. Heinrici could only make a guess as to the size and depth of the Führer bunker. From what he could see, it appeared relatively spacious, with doors leading to rooms on either side of the corridor lounge and beyond. Because of its low ceiling, narrow metal doors, and the absence of windows, this might have been the passageway in a small liner, except that by Heinrici's estimate they were at least 40 feet below ground. Almost immediately, a tall, elegantly dressed SS officer appeared. He was Hitler's personal aide and bodyguard, Colonel Otto Gunsch. Pleasantly, he inquired about their trip and offered them refreshments. Heinrici accepted a cup of coffee. Soon other conference members began to arrive. Hitler's adjutant, General Wilhelm Burgdorf, came next. He greeted them, as Eismann remembers, with some noises about success. Then Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, the OKW Chief of Staff, arrived, followed by Himmler, Admiral Karl Dönitz, and the man reputed to be Hitler's closest confidant, Martin Bormann. In Eismann's words, "All greeted us loudly. Seeing them, I was really proud of my commander. With his familiar stiff posture, serious and measured, he was a soldier from head to toe among court asses." Eismann saw Heinrici tense as Himmler started across the room toward him. In an undertone, the general growled, "That man is never going to set foot in my headquarters. If he ever announces a visit, tell me quickly so I can leave. He makes me vomit." And indeed, Eismann thought Heinrici looked pale as Himmler dragged him into conversation. At that moment, General Hans Krebs, Guderian's successor, came into the room, and seeing Heinrici, came across to him immediately. Earlier in the day, Heinrici had learned from Krebs of the transfer of his vital armoured units to Schörner's army group. Though he blamed Krebs for not vigorously protesting the decision, Heinrici now seemed almost cordial to the new chief of the OKH. At least he did not have to continue talking with Himmler. Krebs, as usual, was diplomatic and solicitous. He had no doubt that everything would work out all right at the conference, he assured Heinrici. Dönitz, Keitel and Bormann now joined them and listened as Heinrici mentioned some of his problems. All three promised their support when Heinrici made his presentation to Hitler. Turning to Eismann, Bormann asked, "What's your opinion about the army group situation, since all this has a direct bearing on Berlin and Germany in general?" Eismann was dumbfounded. With the Russians only 38 miles from the capital and the Allies racing across Germany from the west, the question seemed to border on madness. Bluntly, he replied, "The situation is serious. That's why we're here." Bormann patted him soothingly on the shoulder. "You shouldn't worry so much," he told Eismann. "The Führer is sure to grant you help. You'll get all the forces you need." Eismann stared. Where did Bormann think the forces were to come from? For a moment, he had the uncomfortable feeling that he and Heinrici were the only sane people in the room. More and more officers and staff were filing into the already crowded corridor. Hitler's operations chief, General Alfred Jodl, aloof and composed, arrived with his deputy. The Luftwaffe's chief of staff, General Karl Koller, and Howe's staff chief in charge of supplies and reinforcements, Major General Walter Bühler, came in together. Nearly every man seemed to be followed by an aide, an orderly, or a deputy. The resulting noise and confusion reminded Eismann of a swarm of bees. In the packed corridor, Heinrici now stood silent, listening impassively to the din of conversation. For the most part, it consisted of small talk, trivial and irrelevant. The bunker and its atmosphere were stifling and unreal. Heinrici had the disquieting feeling that the men around Hitler had retreated into a dream world in which they had convinced themselves that by some miracle catastrophe could be averted. Now, as they waited for the man who, they believed, would produce this miracle, there was a sudden movement in the corridor. General Burgdorf, hands high above his head, waved the group into silence. "Gentlemen, gentlemen," he said, "the Führer is coming." "Gustav! Gustav!" Radios sputtered out the warning code for Tempelhof as the planes approached the district. In station masters' offices along the route of the U-Bahn, loudspeakers blared out, "Danger 15!" Another citywide saturation raid had begun. Earth erupted, glass ripped through the air. Chunks of concrete smashed down into the streets, and tornadoes of dust whirled up from 100 places, covering the city in a dark, grey, choking cloud. Men and women raced one another, stumbling and clawing their way into shelters. Ruth Diekermann, just before she reached safety, looked up and saw the bombers coming over in waves, like an assembly line. In the Krupp und Druckenmühle plant, French forced labourer Jacques Delaunay dropped the ghastly remnant of a human arm he had just recovered from the battle-scarred tank he was overhauling and ran for shelter. In the Sieges alley, the marble statues of Brandenburg Prussian rulers rocked and groaned on their pedestals, and the crucifix held aloft by the 12th century leader, Margrave Albert the Bear, shattered against the bust of his eminent contemporary, Bishop Otho of Bamberg. Nearby in Skagerrak Square, police ran for cover, leaving the swaying body of a suicide still hanging from a tree. A shower of incendiaries smashed through the roof of Wing B of the Lehrterstrasse prison and set off a dozen flaring magnesium fires on the second floor. Frantic prisoners, turned loose to fight the flames, stumbled through the acrid smoke with buckets of sand. 2 men suddenly stopped working. The prisoner from cell 244 stared at the man from cell 247. Then they embraced. The brothers Herbert and Kurt Kosny discovered they had been on the same floor for days. In Pankow, in the Mooring's ground-floor 2-room apartment where the Weltlinglers hid, Siegmund hugged his sobbing wife, Margareta, as they stood together in the kitchen. "If this keeps up," he shouted over the din of anti-aircraft fire, "even Jews can go openly to the shelters. They're all too scared of the bombs to turn us in now." 14-year-old Rudolf Reschke had only time enough to see that the planes glinted like silver in the sky, too high for the dangerous game of tag he liked to play with strafing fighters. Then his mother, yelling and nearly hysterical, dragged him down into the cellar where his 9-year-old sister, Christa, sat shivering and crying. The whole shelter seemed to be shaking. Plaster fell from the ceiling and the walls. Then the lights flickered and went out. Frau Reschke and Christa began to pray aloud, and after a minute, Rudolf joined them in the Our Father. The noise of the bombing was getting worse, and the shelter now seemed to be shuddering all the time. The Reschkes had been through many raids, but nothing like this. Frau Reschke, her arms about both children, began to sob. Rudolf had seldom heard his mother cry before, even though he knew that she was often worried, especially with his father at the front. Suddenly he was angry at the planes for making his mother frightened, and for the first time Rudolf felt frightened himself. With some embarrassment he discovered that he was crying too. Before his mother could detain him, Rudolf rushed out of the shelter. He ran up the stairs to the family's ground-floor apartment. There he headed straight for his room and his collection of toy soldiers. He chose the most imposing figure among them, with distinct features painted on its china face. He went to the kitchen and took down his mother's heavy meat cleaver. Oblivious now of the air raid, Rudolf went out into the apartment house courtyard, laid the doll on the ground, and with one stroke chopped off its head. "There," he said, standing back. Tears still staining his face, he looked down without remorse upon the severed head of Adolf Hitler. He came shuffling into the bunker corridor, half bent, dragging his left foot, the left arm shaking uncontrollably. Although he was 5 feet 8.5 inches tall now, with his head and body twisted to the left, he looked much smaller. The eyes that admirers had called magnetic were feverish and red, as if he had not slept for days. His face was puffy, and its colour was a blotchy, faded grey. A pair of pale green spectacles dangled from his right hand. Bright light bothered him now. For a moment he gazed expressionlessly at his generals, as their hands shot up and out to a chorus of "Heil Hitler." The corridor was so crowded that Hitler had some difficulty getting past everyone to reach the small conference room. Eismann noticed that the others began talking again as soon as the Führer passed. There was not the respectful silence he had expected. As for Heinrici, he was shocked by the Führer's appearance. Hitler, he thought, looked like a man who had not more than 24 hours to live. He was a walking corpse. Slowly, as though in pain, Hitler scuffled to his place at the head of the table. To Eismann's surprise, he seemed to crumple like a sack into the armchair, not uttering a word, and held that prostrate condition, his arms propped up on the sides of the chair. Krebs and Bormann moved in behind the Führer to sit on a bench against the wall. From there, Krebs informally presented Heinrici and Eismann. Hitler feebly shook hands with them both. Heinrici noted that he could hardly feel the Führer's hand, for there was no returning pressure. Because of the smallness of the room, not everyone could sit, and Heinrici stood on the Führer's left, Eismann on his right. Keitel, Himmler and Dönitz took chairs on the opposite side of the table. The remainder of the group stayed outside in the corridor. To Heinrici's amazement, they continued to talk, although their voices were now subdued. Krebs began the conference. "In order that the commander," he looked at Heinrici, "can get back to his army group as soon as possible," he said, "I propose that he give his report immediately." Hitler nodded, put on his green glasses, and gestured to Heinrici to begin. In his measured and precise manner, the general got straight to the point. Looking directly at each man around the table, then at Hitler, he said, "My Führer, I must tell you that the enemy is preparing an attack of unusual strength and unusual force. At this moment they are preparing in these areas, from south of Schwedt to south of Frankfurt." On Hitler's own map lying on the table, Heinrici slowly ran his finger down along the threatened section of the Oder front, a line roughly 75 miles long, touching briefly on the cities where he expected the heaviest blows, at Schwedt, in the Freitzen area, around the Kustrin bridgehead, and south of Frankfurt. He entertained no doubts, he said, that the main attack will hit Busse's 9th Army, holding this central area. Also, it will strike the southern flank of von Manteuffel's 3rd Panzer Army around Schwedt. Carefully, Heinrici described how he had juggled his forces to build up Busse's 9th Army against the expected Russian onslaught. But because of this need to strengthen Busse, von Manteuffel had suffered. Part of the 3rd Panzer Army front was now being held by inferior troops, aged Home Guardsmen, a few Hungarian units, and some divisions of Russian defectors, whose dependability was questionable, under General Andrei Vlasov. "Then," said Heinrici flatly, "while the 9th Army is now in better shape than it was, the 3rd Panzer Army is in no state to fight at all. The potential of von Manteuffel's troops, at least in the middle and northern sectors of his front, is low. They have no artillery whatsoever. Anti-aircraft guns cannot replace artillery, and in any case, there is insufficient ammunition even for these." Krebs hastily interrupted. "The 3rd Panzer Army," he said emphatically, "will receive artillery shortly." Heinrici inclined his head, but made no comment. He would believe Krebs when he actually saw the guns. Continuing as though there had been no interruption, he explained to Hitler that the Third Panzer owed its present safe situation to one thing only, the flooded Oder. "I must warn you," he said, "that we can accept the Third Panzer's weak condition only as long as the Oder remains flooded. Once the waters drop," Heinrici added, "the Russians will not fail to attack there too." The men in the room listened attentively, if a little uneasily, to Heinrici's presentation. Such directness at a Hitler conference was unusual. Most officers presented the gains and skipped the drawbacks. Not since Guderian's departure had anyone spoken so frankly, and it was clear that Heinrici was only beginning. Now he turned to the matter of the garrison holding out at Frankfurt on Oder. Hitler had declared the city a fortress, like the ill-fated Kustrin. Heinrici wanted Frankfurt abandoned. He felt the troops there were being sacrificed on the altar of Hitler's fortress mania. They could be saved and used to advantage elsewhere. Guderian, who had shared the same opinion regarding Kustrin, had been broken for his views about that city. Heinrici might meet the same fate for his opposition now, but the Vistula commander saw the men of Frankfurt as his responsibility. Whatever the consequences, he was not to be intimidated. He raised the issue. "In the Ninth Army's sector," he began, "one of the weakest parts of the front is around Frankfurt. The garrison's strength is very low, as is their ammunition. I believe we should abandon the defence of Frankfurt and bring the troops out." Suddenly, Hitler looked up and uttered his first words since the meeting began. He said harshly, "I refuse to accept this." Up to this point, Hitler had sat not only silent but unmoving, as though completely disinterested. Eismann had had the impression that he wasn't even listening. Now the Führer suddenly came awake and began to take an intense interest. He began asking about the garrison's strength, supplies and ammunition, and even, for some incomprehensible reason, about the deployment of Frankfurt's artillery. Heinrici had the answers. Step by step he built his case, taking reports and statistics from Eismann and placing them on the table before the Führer. Hitler looked at the papers as each was handed over and seemed impressed. Sensing his opportunity, Heinrici said quietly but emphatically, "My Führer, I honestly feel that giving up the defence of Frankfurt would be a wise and sound move." To the astonishment of most of those in the room, Hitler, turning to the chief of OKH, said, "Krebs, I believe the general's opinion on Frankfurt is sound. Make out the necessary orders for the army group and give them to me today." In the stunned silence that followed, the babble of voices in the corridor outside seemed unduly loud. Eismann sensed a sudden and new respect for Heinrici. Heinrici himself seemed completely unmoved, he remembered, but he gave me a look which I interpreted as, "Well, we've won." The victory, however, was short-lived. At that moment there was a loud commotion in the corridor, and the vast bulk of Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring filled the doorway of the little conference room. Pushing his way in, Göring heartily greeted those present, pumped Hitler's hand vigorously, and excused himself for being late. He squeezed in next to Dönitz, and there was an uncomfortable delay, while Krebs brought him quickly up to date on Heinrici's briefing. When Krebs had finished, Göring got up and, placing both hands on the map table, leaned toward Hitler as though to make some comment on the proceedings. Instead, smiling widely and with obvious good humour, he said, "I must tell you a story about one of my visits to the 9th Parachute Division." He got no further. Hitler sat suddenly bolt upright in his chair and then jerked himself to his feet. Words poured from his mouth in such a torrent that those present could scarcely understand him. "Before our eyes," recalled Eismann, "he went into a volcanic rage." His fury had nothing to do with Göring. It was a diatribe against his advisers and generals for deliberately refusing to understand him on the tactical use of forts. "Again and again," he yelled, "forts have fulfilled their purpose throughout the war. This was proven at Posen, Breslau, and Schneidermühl. How many Russians were pinned down by them, and how difficult they were to capture. Every one of those forts was held to the very last man. History has proved me right, and my order to defend a fort to the last man is right." Then, looking squarely at Heinrici, he screamed, "That's why Frankfurt is to retain its status as a fort!" As suddenly as it had begun, the tirade ended. But Hitler, though slack with exhaustion, could no longer sit still. He seemed to Eismann to have lost all control of himself. His entire body trembled, he recalled. His hands, in which he was holding some pencils, flew wildly up and down, the pencils beating on the arms of the chair in the process. He gave the impression of being mentally deranged. It was all so unreal, especially the thought that the fate of an entire people lay in the hands of this human ruin. Despite Hitler's choleric outburst, and despite his mercurial change of mind about Frankfurt, Heinrici doggedly refused to give up. Quietly, patiently, almost as though the outburst had not occurred, he went over all the arguments again, underlining every conceivable reason for abandoning Frankfurt. Dönitz, Himmler and Goering supported him, but it was token support at best. The three most powerful generals in the room remained silent. Keitel and Jodl said nothing, and just as Heinrici had expected, Krebs offered no opinion one way or the other. Hitler, apparently spent, only made tired gestures with his hands as he dismissed each argument. Then, with renewed vitality, he demanded to know the credentials of the commander of the Frankfurt garrison, Colonel Bieler. "He is a very reliable and experienced officer," replied Heinrici, "who has proven himself time and again in battle." "Is he a Gneisenau?" snapped Hitler, referring to General Graf von Gneisenau, who had successfully defended the fortress of Kolberg against Napoleon in 1806. Heinrici kept his composure. Evenly he replied that the battle for Frankfurt will prove whether he is a Gneisenau or not. Hitler snapped back, "All right, send Bieler to see me tomorrow so that I can judge him. Then I shall decide what's to be done about Frankfurt." Heinrici had lost the first battle for Frankfurt, and he believed the second, too, in all probability. Bieler was an unprepossessing man who wore thick-lensed glasses. He was not likely to make much of an impression on Hitler. There now approached what Heinrici regarded as the crisis of the meeting. As he began to speak again, he regretted that he had no skill in diplomatic niceties. He knew only one way to express himself. Now, as always, he spoke the unvarnished truth. "My Führer," he said, "I do not believe that the forces on the Oder front will be able to resist the extremely heavy Russian attacks which will be made upon them." Hitler, still trembling, was silent. Heinrici described the lack of combat fitness among the hodgepodge of troops, the very scrapings of Germany's manpower, that made up his forces. Most units in the line were untrained, inexperienced, or so watered down by green reinforcements as to be unreliable. The same was true of many of the commanders. "For example," explained Heinrici, "the 9th Parachute Division worries me. Its commanders and non-commissioned officers are nearly all former administration officers, both untrained and unaccustomed to lead fighting units." Goring suddenly bristled. "My paratroopers!" he said in a loud voice. "You are talking about my paratroopers. They are the best in existence. I won't listen to such degrading remarks. I personally guarantee their fighting capabilities." "Your view, Herr Reichsmarschall," remarked Heinrici icily, "is somewhat biased. I'm not saying anything against your troops, but experience has taught me that untrained units, especially those led by green officers, are often so terribly shocked by their first exposure to artillery bombardment that they are not much good for anything thereafter." Hitler spoke again, his voice now calm and rational. "Everything must be done to train these formations," he declared. "There is certainly time to do this before the battle." Heinrici assured him that every effort would be made in the time still remaining, but he added, "Training will not give them combat experience, and that is what's lacking." Hitler dismissed this theory. The right commanders will provide the experience, and anyway the Russians are fighting with substandard troops too. Stalin, claimed Hitler, is nearing the end of his strength, and about all he has left are slave soldiers whose capabilities are extremely limited. Heinrici found Hitler's misinformation incredible. Emphatically he disagreed. "My Führer," he said, The Russian forces are both capable and enormous. The time to hammer home the truths of the desperate situation had, to Heinrichi's mind, arrived. "I must tell you," he said bluntly, "that since the transfer of the armoured units to Schorner, all my troops, good and bad, must be used as front-line troops. There are no reserves, none. Will they resist the heavy shelling preceding the attack? Will they withstand the initial impact? For a time, perhaps, yes, but against the kind of attack we expect, every one of our divisions will lose a battalion a day. This means that all along the battlefront we will lose divisions themselves at the rate of one per week. We cannot sustain such losses. We have nothing to replace them with." He paused, aware that all eyes were upon him. Then Heinrichi plunged ahead. "My Führer, the fact is that at best we can hold out for just a few days." He looked around the room. "Then," he said, "it must all come to an end." There was dead silence. Heinrichi knew that his figures were indisputable. The men gathered there were as familiar with casualty statistics as he. The difference was that they would not have spoken of them. Goering was the first to break the paralyzing silence. "My Führer," he announced, "I will place immediately at your disposal 100,000 Luftwaffe men. They will report to the Oder front in a few days." Himmler glanced owlishly up at Goering, his arch-rival, then at Hitler, as if sampling the Führer's reaction. Then he, too, made an announcement. "My Führer," he said in his high-pitched voice, "the SS has the honour to furnish 25,000 fighters for the Oder front." Dönitz was not to be outdone. He had already sent a division of Marines to Heinrichi. Now he declared that he, too, would subscribe further forces. "My Führer," he announced, 12,000 sailors will be released immediately from their ships and rushed to the Oder." Heinrichi stared at them. They were volunteering untrained, unequipped, unqualified forces from their own private empires, spending lives instead of money in a sort of ghastly auction. They were bidding against one another, not to save Germany, but to impress Hitler. And suddenly the auction fever became contagious. A chorus of voices sounded as each man tried to suggest other forces that might be available. Someone asked for the reserve army figures, and Hitler called out, "Bühler! Bühler!" Outside in the corridor, where the crowd of waiting generals and orderlies had turned from coffee to brandy, the cry was taken up. "Bühler! Bühler! Where is Bühl?" There was a further commotion as Major General Walter Bühl, staff chief in charge of supplies and reinforcements, pushed through the crowd and entered the conference room. Heinrichi looked at him, and then away in disgust. Bühler had been drinking, and he smelled of it. Nobody else seemed to notice or care, including Hitler. The Führer put a number of questions to Bühler, about reserves, supplies of rifles, small arms and ammunition. Bühler answered thickly and, Heinrichi thought, stupidly, but the answers seemed to satisfy Hitler. According to what he made of Bühl's replies, another 13,000 troops could be scraped up from the so-called reserve army. Dismissing Bühler, Hitler turned to Heinrichi. "There," he said, "you have 150,000 men, about 12 divisions. There are your reserves." The auction was over. Hitler apparently considered the army group's problems settled. Yet all he had done was to buy, at most, 12 more days for the Third Reich, and probably at a tremendous cost in human lives. Heinrichi struggled to preserve his control. "These men," he stated flatly, "are not combat-trained. They have been in rear areas and in offices or on ships, in maintenance work at Luftwaffe bases. They have never fought at the front. They have never seen a Russian." Goering cut in. "The forces I have presented are, for the most part, combat flyers. They are the best of the best. And also there are the troops who were at Monte Cassino, troops whose fame outshone all others." Flushed and voluble, he hotly informed Heinrichi, "These men have the will, the courage, and certainly the experience." Dönitz, too, was angry. "I tell you," he snapped at Heinrichi, "the crews of warships are every bit as good as your Wehrmacht troops." For just a moment Heinrichi himself flared. "Don't you think there's a big difference between fighting at sea and fighting on land?" he asked scathingly. I tell you, all these men will be slaughtered at the front. Slaughtered! If Heinrich's sudden outburst shocked Hitler, he did not show it. As the others fumed, Hitler seemed to have grown icily calm. "All right," he said. "We will place these reserve troops in the second line, about 8 kilometers behind the first. The front line will absorb the shock of the Russian preparatory artillery fire. Meanwhile, the reserves will grow accustomed to battle, and if the Russians break through, they will then fight. To throw back the Russians if they break through, you will have to use the panzer divisions." And he gazed at Heinrici as though awaiting agreement on what was really a very simple matter. Heinrici did not find it so. "You have taken away my most experienced and combat-ready armoured units," he said. "The army group has made a request for their return." Enunciating each word clearly, Heinrici said, "I must have them back." There was a startled movement behind him, and Hitler's adjutant Bergdorf whispered angrily in Heinrici's ear. "Finish," he ordered Heinrici. "You must finish." Heinrici stood his ground. "My Führer," he repeated, ignoring Bergdorf. "I must have those armoured units back." Hitler waved his hand almost apologetically. "I am very sorry," he replied, "but I had to take them from you. Your panzers are needed much more by your southern neighbour. The main attack of the Russians is clearly not aimed at Berlin. There is a stronger concentration of enemy forces to the south of your front in Saxony." Hitler waved his hand over the Russian positions on the Oder. "All of this," he announced in an exhausted, bored voice, "is merely a support attack in order to confuse. The main thrust of the enemy will not be directed at Berlin, but there." Dramatically, he placed a finger on Prague. "Consequently," the Führer continued, "the army group Vistula should be well able to withstand the secondary attacks." Heinrici stared unbelievingly at Hitler. Then he looked at Krebs. Certainly all this must seem equally irrational to the chief of OKH. Krebs spoke up. "Based on the information we have," he explained, "there is nothing to indicate that the Führer's assessment of the situation is wrong." Heinrici had done all he could. "My Führer," he concluded, "I have completed everything possible to prepare for the attack. I cannot consider these 150,000 men as reserves. I also cannot do anything about the terrible losses we must surely sustain. It is my duty to make that absolutely clear. It is also my duty to tell you that I cannot guarantee that the attack can be repelled." Hitler came suddenly to life. Struggling to his feet, he pounded on the table. "Faith!" he yelled. "Faith and strong belief in success will make up for all these insufficiencies. Every commander must be filled with confidence. You," he pointed a finger at Heinrici, "you must radiate this faith. You must instill this belief in your troops." Heinrici stared unflinchingly at Hitler. "My Führer," he said, "I must repeat, it is my duty to repeat, that hope and faith alone will not win this battle." Behind him a voice whispered, "Finish, finish." But Hitler was not even listening to Heinrici. "I tell you, Colonel General," he yelled, "if you are conscious of the fact that this battle should be won, it will be won. If your troops are given the same belief, then you will achieve victory and the greatest success of the war." In the tense silence which followed, Heinrici, white-faced, gathered his papers and handed them to Eismann. The two officers took their leave of the still silent room. Outside, in the corridor lounge, they were told that an air raid was in progress. Numbly, both men stood waiting, each in a kind of stupor, almost unaware of the continuing chatter around them. After a few minutes, they were permitted to leave the bunker. They climbed the stairs and went out into the garden. There, for the first time since he left the conference room, Heinrici spoke. "It's all of no use," he said wearily. "You might just as well try to bring the moon down to earth." He looked up at the heavy smoke palls over the city and repeated softly to himself, "It's all for nothing, all for nothing." The blue waters of the Chiem Sea, like a series of moving mirrors, reflected the great stands of pine that blanketed the foothills all the way up to the snow line. Leaning heavily on his stick, Walter Wenck gazed across the lake and beyond to the vast panoramic tumble of mountains around Berchtesgaden a few miles away. It was a scene of extraordinary beauty and peace. Everywhere the early flowers were out. The snowcaps had begun to disappear from the high ranges, and, although it was only April 6th, even the air was redolent of spring. The peacefulness of his surroundings had done much to speed the convalescence of Guderian's former chief of staff, at 45, the Wehrmacht's youngest general. Here, in the heart of the Bavarian Alps, the war seemed 1,000 miles away. Except for men recuperating from war wounds, or, as in Wenck's case, accidents, there was hardly a soldier to be seen in the entire area. Although still weak, Wenck was on the mend. Considering the seriousness of the accident, he was lucky to be alive. He had sustained head wounds and multiple fractures in a car wreck on February 13th, and had been hospitalized for nearly 6 weeks. So many ribs had been smashed that he was still encased in a surgical corset from chest to thighs. The war seemed over for him, and in any case its outcome was sadly clear. He did not believe the Third Reich could survive more than a few weeks longer. Although Germany's future seemed bleak, Wenck had much to be thankful for. His wife, Irmgard, and their 15-year-old twins, son Helmut and daughter Sigrid, were safe and staying with him in Bavaria. With painful slowness, Wenck walked back to the picturesque little inn where they were living. As he entered the foyer, Irmgard met him with a message. Wenck was to ring Berlin immediately. Hitler's adjutant, General Burgdorf, came on the line. Wenck, Burgdorf said, was to report to Hitler in Berlin the following day. "The Führer," said Burgdorf, "has named you commander of the 12th Army." Wenck was both surprised and puzzled. "The 12th Army?" he asked. "Which one is that?" "You'll learn all about that when you get here," Burgdorf replied. Wenck was still not satisfied. "I've never heard of a 12th Army," he pressed. "The 12th Army," Burgdorf said irritably, as though explaining everything, "is being organized now." Then he hung up. Hours later, in uniform once more, Wenck said goodbye to his distressed wife. "Whatever you do," he warned her, "stay in Bavaria. It's the safest place." Then, totally ignorant of his assignment, he set out for Berlin. Within the next 21 days, the name of this virtually unknown general would become synonymous with hope in the mind of almost every Berliner. The staff was accustomed to seeing an occasional outburst of temper, but nobody had ever seen Heinrici quite like this before. The commander of the army group Vistula was in a towering rage. He had just received a report from Bieler, the officer in charge of the fortress at Frankfurt, on the young colonel's visit to Hitler. As Heinrici had feared, the bespectacled, thin-faced officer had not measured up to Hitler's idea of a Nordic hero. After a few inconsequential remarks, during which Frankfurt was not even mentioned, Hitler shook hands and dismissed the young officer. As soon as Bieler had left the bunker, Hitler ordered a change in the Frankfurt command. "Get someone else," the Führer told Krebs. "Bieler is certainly no Geneisser now." General Buss, whose 9th Army included the Frankfurt garrison, had heard from Krebs of the impending change and had promptly informed Heinrici. Now, as Bieler stood beside Heinrici's desk, the blazing Giftswerk put in a call to Krebs. His staff watched silently. They had learned to tell the measure of Heinrici's temper by the way he drummed on the tabletop with his fingers. Now his right hand was beating out a violent tattoo. Krebs came on the phone. "Krebs," barked Heinrici, "Colonel Bieler is here in my office. I want you to listen carefully. Bieler is to be reinstated as commander of the Frankfurt garrison. I have told this to Burgdorf, and now I'm telling you. I refuse to accept any other officer. Do you understand that?" He did not wait for an answer. "Something else. Where is Bieler's Iron Cross? He has been waiting for that decoration for months. Now he is to get it. Do you understand that?" Still, Heinrici did not pause. "And now listen to me, Krebs," he said. "If Bieler does not get his Iron Cross, if Bieler is not reinstated as commander of Frankfurt, I shall lay down my command. Do you understand that?" Heinrici, still drumming furiously, pressed on. I expect your confirmation on this matter today. Is that clear?" And he slammed down the phone. Krebs had not uttered a word. On the afternoon of April 7th, Colonel Eisman later recalled, "The Army group received 2 teletype messages from the Führer's headquarters. In the first, Bieler was confirmed as commander of Frankfurt. In the second, the Iron Cross was bestowed upon him. General Alfred Jodl, Hitler's chief of operations, sat in his Dahlem office awaiting the arrival of General Wenck. The new 12th Army commander had just left Hitler, and now it was Jodl's job to brief Wenck on the situation on the Western Front. On Jodl's desk was a sheaf of reports from Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, Commander-in-Chief West. They painted a picture that was growing darker almost hourly. Everywhere the Anglo-Americans were breaking through. In theory, the 12th Army was to be the western shield before Berlin, holding about 125 miles of the lower Elbe and Mulde rivers to prevent an Anglo-American drive on the city. Wenck, Hitler had decided, would command an army of 10 divisions composed of Panzer Training Corps officers, Home Guardsmen, cadet forces, various splinter groups, and the remnants of the shattered 11th Army in the Harz Mountains. Even if such a force could be organized in time, Jodl was skeptical that it could have much, if any, effect, and on the Elbe it might never get into action at all, although he had no intention of telling Wenck this. In his office safe, Jodl still held the captured Eclipse plan, the document detailing the moves the Anglo-Americans would make in the event of a German surrender or collapse, and the attached maps showing the agreed zones each ally would occupy at war's end. Jodl remained convinced that the Americans and British would halt on the Elbe, roughly the dividing line between the Anglo-American and Russian post-hostility zones of occupation. It seemed perfectly clear to him that Eisenhower was going to leave Berlin to the Russians. Naturally, ran the last paragraph of General Eisenhower's latest cable to Churchill, if at any moment eclipse conditions, a German collapse or surrender, should come about anywhere along the front, we would rush forward, and Berlin would be included in our important targets. It was as much of a commitment as the Supreme Commander was willing to make. It did not satisfy the British, and their chiefs of staff continued to press for a clear-cut decision. They messaged Washington urging a meeting to discuss Eisenhower's strategy. Stalin's cable had roused their suspicions. While the Generalissimo had stated that he planned to begin his offensive in the middle of May, said the British chiefs, he had not indicated when he intended to launch his secondary forces in the direction of Berlin. Thus, it still seemed to them that Berlin should be captured as soon as possible. Further, they believed it would be appropriate for the combined chiefs of staff to give Eisenhower guidance on the matter. The reply from General Marshall firmly and decisively ended the discussion. Such psychological and political advantages as would result from the possible capture of Berlin ahead of the Russians, he said, should not override the imperative military consideration, which in our opinion is the destruction and dismembering of the German armed forces. Marshall did not entirely close the door on the possibility of taking Berlin, for, as a matter of fact, it is within the centre of the impact of the main thrust. But there was no time for the combined chiefs of staff to give the problem any lengthy consideration. The speed of the Allied advance into Germany was now so fast, he said, that it outstripped the possibility of review of operational matters by this or any other form of committee action. And Marshall ended with an unequivocal endorsement of the Supreme Commander. Only Eisenhower is in a position to know how to fight his battle and to exploit to the full the changing situation. The harassed Eisenhower, for his part, had declared himself willing to change his plans, but only if ordered to do so. On April 7th he wired Marshall, "At any time that we can seize Berlin at little cost, we should of course do so." But because the Russians were so close to the capital, he regarded it as militarily unsound at this stage of the proceedings to make Berlin a major objective. He was the first, said Eisenhower, to admit that war is waged in pursuance of political aims, and if the combined chiefs of staff should decide that the Allied effort to take Berlin outweighs purely military considerations in this theatre, I would cheerfully readjust my plans and thinking so as to carry out such an operation. He stressed his belief, however, that the capture of Berlin should be left as something that we should do if feasible and practicable as we proceed on the general plan of A. Dividing the German forces, B. Anchoring our left firmly in the Lübeck area, and C. Attempting to disrupt any German effort to establish a fortress in the southern mountains. He gave almost the same answer to Montgomery the following day. Monty had picked up the cudgels where Churchill and the British chiefs left off. He asked Eisenhower for 10 extra divisions to attack toward Lübeck and Berlin. Eisenhower turned him down. "As regards Berlin," declared the Supreme Commander, "I am quite ready to admit that it has political and psychological significance, but of far greater importance will be the location of the remaining German forces in relation to Berlin. It is on them that I am going to concentrate my attention. Naturally, if I can get a chance to take Berlin cheaply, I shall do so." At this point, Churchill decided to end the controversy before there was further deterioration of the Allied relationship. He informed President Roosevelt that he considered the affair closed. "To prove my sincerity," he cabled the President, "I will use one of my very few Latin quotations. Amantium irae amoris integratio estimated." Translated, it meant, "Lovers' quarrels are a renewal of love." But while the controversy over SKF 252 and the Anglo-American objectives had been taking place behind the scenes, the men of the Anglo-American forces had been driving deeper by the hour into Germany. Nobody had told them that Berlin was no longer a major military objective. Contrary to generally accepted belief, the deterioration of Hitler's health was not the result of injuries sustained during the attempted bomb plot on his life in 1944, though it seems to have marked the beginning of a rapid debilitation. After the war, US counterintelligence teams interrogated nearly every doctor who had attended Hitler. The author has read all their reports, and, while none of them give a specific cause for Hitler's palsied condition, the general opinion is that, in origin, it was partly psychogenic, and partly caused by the manner in which he lived. Hitler hardly ever slept. Night and day had little distinction for him. In addition, there is abundant evidence that he was slowly being poisoned by the indiscriminate use of drugs administered to him in massive injections by his favourite physician, Professor Theodore Morell. These ranged from prescriptions containing morphia, arsenic and strychnine to various artificial stimulants and mysterious miracle drugs, which the doctor himself compounded. As Heinrici put it in an interview with the author, Bühler was waving a large brandy flag in front of him. Heinrici was later to say, "Hitler's statement killed me completely. I could hardly argue against it, for I did not know what the situation opposite Schöner's group was. I did know that Hitler was completely wrong. All I could think of was, how can anyone delude themselves to this extent? I realized that they were all living in a cloud cuckoo land, Wolkenkuckucksheim." The research for Hitler's conference comes principally from Heinrici's diaries, supplemented by a long 186-page memoir from Colonel Eismann. Heinrici kept meticulous notes of everything that happened, including the exact words Hitler used. There are some differences between Heinrici's account and that of Eismann's, but these variations were resolved by a long series of interviews with Heinrici over a 3-month period in 1963. Never in the history of warfare had so many men moved so fast. The speed of the Anglo-American offensive was contagious, and all along the front the drive was taking on the proportions of a giant contest. As the armies concentrated on gaining the banks of the Elbe to secure the bridgeheads for the last victorious dash that would end the war, every division along the north and centre of the Western Front was determined to reach the river first. Beyond, Berlin, as always, was the final goal. In the British zone, the 7th Armoured Division, the famed Desert Rats, had hardly paused since leaving the Rhine. Once across, Major General Louis Lien, the 7th's commander, had emphasized that, "For all ranks, your eyes should now be firmly fixed on the river Elbe. Once we get started, I do not propose to stop by day or by night till we get there. Good hunting on the next lap." Now, even against heavy opposition, the Desert Rats were averaging upward of 20 miles a day. Squadron Sergeant Major Charles Hennell thought it right and proper for the 7th to take the capital as a reward for our long and arduous efforts in the war from the Western Desert onwards. Hennel had been with the Desert Rats since El Alamein. Sergeant Major Eric Cole had an even more compelling reason to reach Berlin. A veteran of Dunkirk, he had been driven into the sea by the Germans in 1940. Now Cole was grimly preparing to even the score. He constantly badgered the armoured crews to get their mechanized equipment in tip-top running condition. Cole planned to drive the Germans in front of the 7th Armoured Tanks all the way back to Berlin. The men of the British 6th Airborne Division had led their countrymen into Normandy on D-Day. They were determined to lead them on to the end. Sergeant Hugh McWhinney had heard from German prisoners that the moment the British crossed the Elbe, the enemy would open the door and let them through to Berlin. He doubted it. The 6th was used to fighting for every mile. Captain Wilfred Davison of the 13th Parachute Battalion was certain that there would be a race for the city, but, like most of the division, he had no doubt that the 6th was in the running to lead the way. But at division headquarters, Captain John L. Shearer was becoming a little anxious. He had heard a rumour that Berlin was being left to the Americans. U.S. airborne divisions had heard the same rumour. The trouble was that it made no mention of paratroopers. At General James Gavin's 82nd Airborne Staging Area, where shootists had been training for days, it was now all too clear that a fighting drop on Berlin was out. Apparently an airborne operation would result only if a sudden enemy collapse put the Eclipse plan into action, making it necessary for the troopers to go to Berlin on a policing mission. But this seemed remote. Schaeff had already instructed General Louis Brereton's 1st Airborne Army that it would soon be making relief drops on Allied POW camps under the code name Operation Jubilant. Much as they wanted POWs freed, the prospect of a rescue operation instead of a fighting assignment filled the men of the Airborne Army with something less than jubilance. Similar frustration characterized other airborne groups. General Maxwell Taylor's Screaming Eagles of the 101st Airborne Division were once more fighting as foot soldiers, this time in the Ruhr. One regiment of Gavin's 82nd had been ordered there too. The 82nd had also been alerted to help Montgomery's 21st Army Group in a later operation across the Elbe. It was Private Arthur Dutch Schultz of the 505th Parachute Regiment who perhaps best summed up the feelings of the men of the airborne divisions. Climbing aboard a truck headed for the Ruhr, he cynically told his pal, Private Joe Tallett, "So, I lead 'em into Normandy, yes? Into Holland, yes? Look at me, kid. I'm a blue-blooded American and the country's got only one of me. They want to get their money's worth. They ain't going to waste me on Berlin. Hell no! They're saving me up. They're going to drop me on Tokyo." But if the airborne divisions were dispirited, the land armies were brimming over with anticipation. In the centre, US forces were going all out and their strength was enormous. With the return of Simpson's massive 9th Army from Montgomery's 21st Army Group, Bradley had become the first general in American history to command 4 field armies. Besides the 9th, his forces included the 1st, 3rd and 15th, close to 1 million men. On April 2nd, just 9 days after crossing the Rhine, his troops had finished springing the trap encircling the Ruhr. Caught in the 4,000 square-mile pocket was Field Marshal Walter Model's Army Group B, numbering no fewer than 325,000 men. With Model contained, the Western Front was wide open, and Bradley swept boldly on, leaving part of the 9th and 1st Armies to mop up the pocket. Now his forces were in full cry. With the British in the north and General Devers's US 6th Army Group in the south holding the flanks, Bradley was driving furiously through Germany's centre toward Leipzig and Dresden. In the north-to-south lineup of US armies, the 9th was the shortest distance from the Elbe, and it looked to commanders as if Bradley had given Simpson the go-ahead for the dash that, by its very momentum, should take US forces to Berlin. The day the encirclement of the Ruhr was completed, Eisenhower issued orders to his forces. Bradley's group was to mop up the Ruhr, launch a thrust with its main axis, Kassel-Leipzig, seize any opportunity to capture a bridgehead over the River Elbe, and be prepared to conduct operations beyond the Elbe. On April 4th, the day the 9th was returned to him, Bradley himself gave new commands to his armies. In the 12th Army Group's Letter of Instructions No. 20, the 9th was directed first to drive for a line roughly south of Hanover with the army centre in the approximate area of the town of Hildesheim, about 70 miles from the Elbe. Then, on order, the second phase would begin. It was this vital paragraph that spelled out the role of the 9th Army, and, to its commander, left no doubt as to the destination of his forces. It read, Phase 2. Advance on order to the east. Exploit any opportunity for seizing a bridgehead over the Elbe and be prepared to continue the advance on Berlin or to the northeast. Phase 1, the drive toward Hildesheim, seemed to be simply a directional order. No one expected to be held there. But Phase 2 was the starting flag that every division in the 9th Army had been awaiting, none more eagerly than the commander, Lieutenant General William Big Simp Simpson. My people were keyed up, General Simpson was to recall later. We'd been the first to the Rhine, and now we were going to be the first to Berlin. All along we thought of just one thing, capturing Berlin, going through and meeting the Russians on the other side. From the time the letter of instructions came down from the Army Group, Simpson had not wasted a minute. He expected to reach the Hildesheim phase line in a matter of days. After that, Simpson told his staff officers, he planned to get an armoured and an infantry division set up on the Autobahn running just above Magdeburg on the Elbe to Potsdam, where we'll be ready to close in on Berlin. Then Simpson intended to commit the rest of the 9th as fast as we can, if we get the bridgehead and they turn us loose. Jubilantly he told his staff, Damn, I want to get to Berlin, and all you people, right down to the last private, I think, want it too. Major General Isaac D. White, the determined, wiry commander of the 2nd Armoured Hell on Wheels Division, was a good step ahead of Simpson. His plan to take Berlin had been ready even before his men crossed the Rhine. White's operations chief, Colonel Briard P. Johnson, had plotted the drive on the capital weeks before. So thorough was his plan that detailed orders and map overlays were ready by March 25th. The 2nd's assault plan was somewhat similar to Simpson's own concept. It, too, followed the Autobahn from Magdeburg on the Elbe. Proposed day-by-day advances were drawn on the map overlays, and each stage was given a code name. The last dash of about 60 miles from Magdeburg carried phase lines with the names Silver, Silk, Satin, Daisy, Pansy, Jug, and finally, imposed on a huge blue swastika covering Berlin, the code word Goal. At the rate the 2nd was moving, against only spotty opposition, often achieving upward of 35 miles a day, White was confident of grabbing the capital. If his men could secure a bridgehead at Magdeburg, now only 80 miles away, White expected to dash into Berlin within 48 hours. Now, along the 9th Army's 50-odd miles of front, White's 2nd Armoured was spearheading the drive. The division was one of the largest formations on the Western Front. With its tanks, self-propelled guns, armoured cars, bulldozers, trucks, jeeps and artillery, it formed a stream more than 72 miles long. To create maximum fighting effectiveness, the force had been broken into 3 armoured units, Combat Commands A, B and R, the latter held in reserve. Even so, the division, moving in tandem and averaging about 2 miles an hour, took nearly 12 hours to pass a given point. This ponderous armoured force was running ahead of every other unit of the 9th Army, with one notable exception. On its right flank, tenaciously pacing the 2nd mile for mile and fighting all the way, was a wildly assorted collection of vehicles crammed with troops. From the air, it bore no resemblance to either an armoured or an infantry division. In fact, but for a number of US Army trucks interspersed among its columns, it might easily have been mistaken for a German convoy. Major General Robert C. Macon's highly individualistic 83rd Infantry Division, the Ragtag Circus, was going hell for leather toward the Elbe in its captured booty. Every enemy unit or town that surrendered or was captured subscribed its quota of rolling stock for the division, usually at gunpoint. Every newly acquired vehicle got a quick coat of olive green paint and a US star slapped on its side, Then it joined the 83rd. The men of the ragtag circus had even managed to liberate a German airplane, and Harder had found someone to fly it, and it was spreading consternation all over the front. First, Sergeant William G. Presnell of the 30th Infantry Division, who had fought all the way from Omaha Beach, knew the silhouette of every Luftwaffe fighter. So when he saw what was obviously a German plane heading in his direction, he yelled, "Me 109!" and dived for cover. Puzzled when there was no burst of machine gun fire, he raised his head and stared as the fighter sped away. The plane was painted a blotchy olive green. On the undersides of the wings were the words 83rd Infant Div. If their compatriots were confused by the 83rd's vehicles, the Germans were even more so. As the division rushed pell-mell toward the Elbe, Major Haley Kohler heard the insistent blowing of a car horn. "This Mercedes came up behind us," he recalled, and then began passing everything on the road. Captain John J. Devaney saw it too. "The car weaved in and out of our column, going in our direction," he remembered. As it passed, Devaney was astounded to see that it was a chauffeur-driven German staff car with a full load of officers. A burst of machine gun fire stopped the vehicle, and the bewildered Germans were taken prisoner in the middle of what they had supposed to be one of their own columns. The Mercedes, in top condition, received the usual hurried paint job and was immediately put to use. This map shows the U.S. Ninth Army's plan for the advance to Berlin. General Macon was determined that the 83rd would be the first infantry division to cross the Elbe and advance to Berlin. The rivalry between the 83rd and the 2nd Armoured was now so intense that when leading units of the two divisions reached the Weser River at the same time on April 5th, there was considerable argument, as Macon put it, as to who was to cross the river first. Eventually, a compromise was reached. The divisions crossed together by sandwiching their units. Back at 83rd headquarters, rumour had it that General White was furious with the ragtag circus. "No damned infantry division," the 2nd's commander was quoted as saying, "is going to beat my outfit to the Elbe." The 2nd was running into other competition too. The 5th Armoured Victory Division was rolling almost as fast as White's columns, and its men had plans of their own for taking the capital. The only big question at the time was who was going to get Berlin first, remembers Colonel Gilbert Farrand, the 5th's Chief of Staff. "We planned to cross the Elbe at Tangermunde, Sandau, Arneburg and Verben. We heard that the Russians were ready to go, so we made every possible preparation. The division was on the move so continuously that, as Farrand remembers it, no one slept more than 4 or 5 hours a night, and often no one slept at all. Because of the steadiness of the advance, Farrand's own half-track was now the division's headquarters. The 5th's progress was greatly helped by the spottiness of the opposition. The advance was really nothing more, Farrand recalls, than cracking rear-guard actions. But these could be deadly, as Farrand discovered when a shell ploughed through his half-track. Among the infantry divisions, the 84th, 30th and 102nd had their eyes on Berlin too. Everywhere in the 9th, tired and dirty men, eating on the move, were hoping to be in on the kill. The very momentum of the drive was exhilarating. Still, despite the absence of a general pattern of German defence, there was fighting, and at times it was heavy. In some areas, diehards put up fierce resistance before surrendering. Lieutenant Colonel Roland Kolb of the 84th Rail Splitters Division noticed that the worst fighting came from scattered SS units that hid in the woods and harassed the advancing troops. The armoured columns usually bypassed these fanatic remnants and left them to the infantry to mop up. Desperate encounters often took place in small towns. At one point in the advance, Kolb was shocked to find children of 12 and undermanning artillery pieces. Rather than surrender, he remembers, the boys fought until killed. Other men also experienced moments of horror. Near the wooded ridges of the Teutoburger Wald, Major James F. Hollingsworth, leading the 2nd Armoured's advance guard, found himself suddenly surrounded by German tanks. His column had run directly into a panzer training ground. Luckily for Hollingsworth, the tanks were relics from which the engines had been long since removed. but their guns were in place for use in training recruits, and the Germans quickly opened fire. Staff Sergeant Clyde W. Cooley, a veteran of North Africa, and the gunner on Hollingsworth's tank swung into action. Revolving his turret, he knocked out a German tank at 1,500 yards. Turning again, he blasted another 75 yards away. "All hell broke loose as everyone opened up," recalls Hollingsworth. Then, just as the fight ended, a German truck filled with soldiers came barreling down the road toward the 2nd Armoured's column. Hollingsworth hastily ordered his men to wait until the truck was in range. At 75 yards, he gave the order to open fire. The truck, riddled by .50 caliber machine gun bullets, blazed, turned over, and threw its uniformed occupants out onto the road. Most were dead by the time they hit the ground, but a few were still alive and screaming horribly. It was only when he came up to inspect the torn and riddled bodies that Hollingsworth discovered the soldiers were uniformed German women, the equivalent of US WACs. The opposition was completely unpredictable. Many areas capitulated without firing a shot. In some towns and cities, burgomasters surrendered while the withdrawing German troops were still moving through the populated areas, often no more than a block away from American tanks and infantry. At Detmold, where one of Germany's largest armament works was located, a civilian met the lead tank of Lieutenant Colonel Wheeler G. Merriam's 82nd Reconnaissance Battalion, scouting ahead of the 2nd Armoured. The German representative announced that the superintendent of the factory wished to surrender. "Shells were falling all about us as we drove in," Merriam recalls. Lined up outside the factory were the superintendent, the factory manager, and the workers. The superintendent made a little speech of surrender and then presented me with a beautifully chromed Mauser pistol. A few blocks farther on, Merriam took the surrender of an entire German paymaster company, complete with vast quantities of banknotes. But a few hours later, US infantry coming up behind Merriam fought a bitter and prolonged battle to clean out the same town. Detmold, as it turned out, was in the centre of an SS training area. Similar incidents occurred everywhere. In some small cities, the silence of surrender in one area would be suddenly shattered by the din of fierce fighting a few blocks away. On the main street of one such city, General Macon, the 83rd's commander, remembers walking quite safely through the front entrance of my headquarters, but when I tried to leave by the back door, I almost had to fight my way out. On the outskirts of one town, troops of the 30th Infantry were met by German soldiers with white handkerchiefs tied to their rifles. As the Germans tried to surrender to the Americans, they were machine-gunned in the back by SS stragglers who still fought on. Some men developed new techniques for securing surrenders. Captain Francis Schommer of the 83rd Division, who spoke fluent German, several times conducted capitulations by telephone, bolstered by a Colt .45. Schommer, his pistol pointed at a newly captured burgomaster, would inform the mayor that it might be wise for you to telephone the burgomaster of the next town and inform him that, if he wants the place to remain standing, he better surrender it right now. Tell him to get the people to hang sheets from their windows, or else. The frightened burgomaster would usually pour it on, telling his neighbour that the Americans in his town had hundreds of tanks and artillery pieces, and thousands upon thousands of troops. The ruse worked again and again. As the Great Drive gathered momentum, the roads became jammed with motorized troops and armoured columns pushing east past thousands of German prisoners going west. There was not even time to take charge of the prisoners. Exhausted and unshaven, Wehrmacht officers and privates trudged back toward the Rhine unaccompanied. Some of them still carried weapons. Chaplain Ben L. Rose of the 113th Mechanized Cavalry Group recalls the hopeless look of two officers who, in full-dress uniform, walked alongside his column, trying to get someone to notice them long enough to surrender their sidearms. But the troopers, intent on piling up mileage, simply thumbed them west. Cities and towns fell to the onrushing forces one after another. Few men had heard their names before, and, in any case, no one stayed long enough to remember them. Places like Minden, Buckeberg, Tunden and Stadtingen were merely checkpoints on the way to the Elbe. But the troops of the 30th Division encountered a familiar name, so familiar that most men remember being surprised that it actually existed. The town was Hamelin, of Pied Piper fame. Suicidal opposition from a few SS strongpoints bypassed earlier by the 2nd Armoured, and heavy retaliatory shelling by the 30th reduced the storybook city of gingerbread houses and cobblestoned streets to a burned and blasted rubble by April 5th. "This time," said Colonel Walter M. Johnson of the 117th Regiment, "we got the rats out with a slightly different kind of flute." By April 8th, the 84th Division had reached the outskirts of 15th-century Hanover. On the long drive from the Rhine, Hanover, with a population of 400,000, was the largest city to fall to any division of the 9th Army. Major General Alexander R. Bowling, commander of the 84th, had expected to bypass the city to continue the drive to Berlin. But when a German soldier emerged from the outskirts and surrendered, Bowling learned that he had no choice but to move on the city. "It was too late to bypass Hanover," he said. "The Germans were already digging in." There was no opportunity for a detailed survey of the ancient city's defences. All the intelligence officers had at hand was a hastily drawn map made by the German surrendering soldier. "We went in and hit the city hard and fast," Bowling remembers. Despite the confusion of sudden street fighting, the 84th secured a foothold in the city. Though the diversion was adding almost 100 miles to his journey, Wenck had a reason for the detour. In a Weimar bank were his life savings, some 10,000 marks, and he intended to withdraw the entire sum. But as his car approached the city, the roads became strangely empty, and the crack of gunfire sounded in the distance. A few kilometres further, the car was halted, and Wehrmacht military police informed the general that tanks of Patton's US Third Army were already on the outskirts. Wenck felt both shocked and deceived. The situation was much worse than he had been told at Hitler's headquarters. He could not believe that the Allies had advanced so fast, or that so much of Germany was already overrun. It was also hard to concede that, in all probability, his 10,000 marks were gone too. From local headquarters, Wehrmacht officers told Wenck that the entire Harz region was endangered, troops were retreating, and areas were being outflanked. Obviously, his headquarters had already pulled out of the area. Wenck headed back toward Dessau, where some of his army was supposedly gathering. Near Roßlau, about 8 miles north of Dessau, he discovered his headquarters in a former Wehrmacht engineering school. There, too, Wenck discovered the truth about the 12th Army. Its front ran along the Elbe and its tributary, the Mulde, for a distance of about 125 miles, roughly from Wittenberge on the Elbe to the north, then south to a point just below and east of Leipzig on the Mulde. On the northern flank, facing the British, were the forces of Field Marshal Ernst Busch, Commander-in-Chief, northwest. On the south were the badly mauled units of Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, Commander-in-Chief, west. Wenck had little information about the strength of these forces. In his section, between the two, the 12th Army existed mainly on paper. Other than troops holding scattered positions along the Elbe, he had little but the scant remains of ghost divisions. Other groups, he found, were not yet operational, and there were even shadow units still to be formed. The bulk of his artillery was immobile, set in fixed positions around such towns as Magdeburg, Wittenberge, and near bridge or crossing sites along the Elbe. There were some self-propelled guns, a group of armoured cars, and some 40 small jeep-like Volkswagen troop carriers. But Wenck's 12th Army at this moment had at best only about a dozen tanks. Although presumably the scattered and splinter troops would eventually bring his forces up to about 100,000 men, right now he had nowhere near the 10 divisions he had been promised. Amid the remnants of units with impressive names, Clausewitz, Potsdam, Scharnhorst, Ulrich von Hutten, Friedrich Ludwig Jahn, Theodor Körner, there remained at most 5.5 divisions, about 55,000 men. Apart from forces already committed to set positions or in actual combat, the bulk of the new 12th Army was made up of eager cadets and training officers. Neither Wenck nor his chief of staff, Colonel Gunther Reichhelm, had any doubt about the eventual outcome of the battles ahead. But Wenck refused to give in to disillusionment. Young and eager himself, he saw what many an older general might have missed. What the 12th lacked in strength it might well make up by the fierceness and dedication of young officers and cadets. Wenck thought he saw a way to use his green but enthusiastic forces as mobile shock troops, rushing them from area to area as needed, at least until his other forces were regrouped and in position. Wenck believed in this fashion his energetic youngsters might buy Germany precious time. Almost his first move as commander was to order his strongest and best-equipped formations into central positions for use on either the Elbe or Mulde rivers. Looking at his map, Wenck circled the areas of probable action: Bitterfeld, Dessau, Belzig, Wittenberge. There was one other site, he thought, where the Americans would surely try to cross the Elbe. Lying within 3 arms of the river, devastated during the 30 Years' War and almost wholly destroyed, the town of Magdeburg had risen again. Now, the great fortress with its island citadel and 11th-century cathedral stood like a beacon in the path of the American armies. Around this area, particularly south of Magdeburg, Wenck assigned the best-equipped of his Scharnhorst, Potsdam and von Hutten units to stand off the US assault as well as they could. His defences were planned down to the last detail, his tactics committed to memory by his officers. Now, at Army Group Vistula headquarters, approximately 120 miles northeast of Wenck, Gotthard Heinrici was ready for the battle. Behind his first Hauptkampflinie, the main line of resistance, Heinrici had developed a second line. Just before the expected Russian artillery barrage, Heinrici had told his commanders, he would order the evacuation of the front line. Immediately all troops would retreat to the second Hauptkampflinie. It was Heinrici's old Moscow trick of letting the Russians hit an empty bag. As quickly as the Russian bombardment lifted, the troops were to move forward and take up their front-line positions again. The ruse had worked in the past, and Heinrici was counting on its success again. The trick, as always, was to determine the exact moment of attack. There had been several feints already. In von Manteuffel's 3rd Panzer Army sector north of Berlin, General Martin Garres, commanding the weak 46th Panzer Corps, was convinced that the attack would take place on April 8th. The heavy forward movement of vehicles and the deepening concentration of artillery directly in front of Garres's area seemed to indicate an imminent assault, and captured Russian soldiers had even boasted of the date. Heinrici did not believe the reports. His own intelligence, plus his old habit of trusting his instinct, told him the date was too early. As it turned out, he was right. All along the Oder front, April 8th was quiet and uneventful. Yet Heinrici's vigilance was now unceasing. Each day he flew over the Russian lines in a small reconnaissance plane, observing troop and artillery dispositions. Each night he painstakingly studied late intelligence reports and prisoner interrogations, searching always for the clue that might pinpoint the time of attack. It was during this tense and critical period that Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring summoned Heinrici to his castle for lunch. Though Heinrici was desperately weary and loath to be gone from his headquarters even for a few hours, he could not refuse. Karinhol, the Reichsmarschall's huge estate, lay only a few miles from the Vistula headquarters at Birkenhain. The grounds were so vast that Göring even had his own private zoo. As they approached, Heinrici and his aide, Captain von Bieler, were amazed by the magnificence of Göring's park-like holdings, with vistas of lakes, gardens, landscaped terraces, and tree-lined drives. Lining the road from the main gates to the castle itself were units of sprucely uniformed Luftwaffe paratroopers, Göring's personal defence force. The castle, like Göring himself, was both massive and opulent. The reception hall reminded Heinrici of a church so large, so huge, that one's eye automatically travelled up to the roof beams. Göring, resplendent in a white hunting jacket, greeted Heinrici coolly. His attitude was a portent of what was to come, for the luncheon was a disaster. The Reichsmarschall and the general disliked each other intensely. Heinrici had always blamed Göring for the loss of Stalingrad, where, Despite all his promises, the Luftwaffe had been unable to supply the cut-off troops of von Paulus's Sixth Army. But Heinrici would have disliked the Reichsmarschall in any case for his arrogance and pomposity. For his part, Göring found Heinrici dangerously insubordinate. He had never forgiven the general for leaving Smolensk unscorched, and in the past few days his distaste for Heinrici had greatly increased. Heinrici's remarks about the 9th paratroopers at the Führer's conference had rankled deeply. The day following that meeting, Göring had telephoned Vistula headquarters and spoken to Colonel Eismann. "It is inconceivable to me," said the Reichsmarschall angrily, "that Heinrici would talk about my paratroopers the way he did. It was a personal insult. I still have the 2nd Parachute Division, and you can tell your commander from me that he's not getting them. No, I'm giving them to Schorner. There's a real soldier, a true soldier." Now, at the luncheon, Göring turned his attack directly on Heinrici. He began by sharply criticizing the troops he had seen during recent trips along the Vistula front. Sitting back in a huge throne-like chair and waving a large silver beaker of beer, Göring accused Heinrici of poor discipline throughout his command. "I've driven all over your armies," he said, "and in one sector after another I found men doing nothing. I saw some in foxholes playing cards. I found men from the labour organisation who didn't even have spades to do their jobs. In some places I found men without field kitchens. In other sections almost nothing has been done to build defences. Everywhere I found your people loafing, doing nothing." Taking a great swallow of beer, Göring said menacingly, "I intend to bring all this to the attention of the Führer." Heinrici saw no point in arguing. All he wanted to do was get away. Keeping his temper in check, Heinrici somehow got through the meal. But as Göring saw his two visitors to the door, Heinrici paused, looking slowly around the magnificent grounds and the impressive castle with its turrets and wings. "I can only hope," he said, "that my loafers can save this beautiful place of yours from the battles that lie ahead." Göring stared icily for a moment, then turned on his heel and walked back inside. Göring would not have Karinhall much longer, Heinrici thought as he drove away. He was beginning to reach a conclusion about the timing of the Russian attack, based on intelligence reports, aerial observations, the steadily dropping flood waters of the Oder, and that intuition which had never yet betrayed him. Heinrici believed the attack would begin within the week, somewhere around the 15th or 16th of April. Pulling back the covering sheet on the table, Marshal Georgy Zhukov exposed the huge relief map of Berlin. It was more a model than a map, with miniature government buildings, bridges and railroad stations showing an exact replica against the principal streets, canals and airfields. Expected defensive positions, flak towers and bunkers were all neatly marked, and small green tags, each with a number, flagged principal objectives. The Reichstag was labelled 105, the Reichskanzlei 106, 107, 8 were the offices of the Ministries of Internal and Foreign Affairs. The Marshal turned to his officers. "Look at Objective 105, he said. "Who is going to be the first to reach the Reichstag? Chuikov and his 8th Guards? Katukov and his tanks? Berzarin and his 5th Shock Army? Or maybe Bogdanov with his 2nd Guards? Who will it be?" Zhukov was deliberately baiting his officers. Each was in a frenzy to reach the city first, and in particular to capture the Reichstag. As General Nikolai Popiel later remembered the scene, Katukov, presumably already there in his mind's eye, said suddenly, "Just think, if I reach 107 and 108, I might grab Himmler and Ribbentrop together." All day the briefings had been in progress. Along the front preparations for the attacks were nearly complete. Guns and ammunition were positioned in the forests. Tanks were moving up so their guns could supplement the artillery when the bombardment began. A vast store of supplies, bridging materials, rubber boats and rafts was ready in the attack areas, and convoy after convoy jammed the roads, bringing divisions up to the assembly areas. So frantic were demands for troops that the Russians for the first time were airlifting men from rear areas. It was obvious to Russian soldiers everywhere that the attack would come soon. yet no one below headquarters level had been given the date. Captain Sergei Ivanovich Golubov, the Red Army correspondent, drove along Zhukov's front, watching the massive preparations. Golubov had tapped all his sources in an effort to find out the date of the attack, but without success. Never before had he witnessed activity such as this prior to an attack, and he was convinced that the Germans must be watching every move. But, he commented long afterward, no one seemed to give a damn what the Germans saw. One aspect of the preparations puzzled Golubov. For days now, anti-aircraft searchlights of all sizes and shapes had been arriving at the front. The crews were women. Moreover, these units were being held well back from the front and carefully hidden beneath camouflage netting. Golubov had never seen so many searchlights before. He wondered what they could possibly have to do with the attack. At the Berlin Reichspostzentralamt, the Postal Services Administration building in Tempelhof, Reich Postal Minister Wilhelm Ohnesorger leaned over the brilliantly coloured sheets of stamps on his desk. They were the first run, and Ohnesorger was inordinately pleased by them. The artist had done a fine job, and the Führer was certain to be gratified by the results. With delight, he examined two of the stamps more closely. One showed an SS soldier with a Schmeisser machine pistol at his shoulder. The other depicted a uniformed Nazi party leader, a torch upraised in his right hand. Ohnesorger thought the special commemorative issues did justice to the occasion. They would be on sale on Hitler's birthday, April 20th. A special date was also uppermost in Erich Bayer's mind. The Wilmersdorf accountant had been worrying for weeks about what he would do on Tuesday, April 10th, tomorrow. The payment had to be made by then, otherwise all sorts of trouble and red tape could result. Bayer had the money, that was not his problem. But did it matter now? Would the army that captured Berlin, American or Russian, insist on payment? And what if neither got the city? Bayer considered the matter from all sides. Then he went to his bank and withdrew 1,400 marks. Entering the office nearby, he made the required down payment on his income tax for 1945. It happened so fast that everyone was taken by surprise. On the Western Front, at his 9th Army headquarters, General Simpson immediately passed the word down to his two corps commanders, Major General Raymond S. McLean of the 19th and Major General Alvan Gillam of the 13th. Official orders would follow, Simpson said, but the word was, go. Phase 2 was on. It was official. The divisions were to jump off for the Elbe and beyond. At the 2nd Armoured Division headquarters, General White got the news and promptly sent for Colonel Paul A. Disney, commanding the 67th Armoured Regiment, the 2nd's lead unit. Upon arrival, Disney remembered, I barely had time to say hello when White said, take off for the east. For just a moment, Disney was taken aback. The stand-down had lasted a mere 24 hours. Still confused, he asked, what's the objective? White answered with just one word, Berlin. Simpson had every reason to believe he had been given the go-ahead. In the same 12th Army Group order, the US 1st and 3rd Armies were instructed in the second phase to seize bridgeheads on the Elbe and be prepared to drive east. In the case of Patton's 3rd, the expression used was east or southeast. But only in 9th Army's order were the words on Berlin included. The persistent Wenck tried to lay claim to his money after the war, but by then Weimar was in the Soviet zone and under the administration of Ulbricht's East German government. Curiously, the bank continued to send Wenck monthly statements up to July 4, 1947. He acknowledged the statements repeatedly, asking that the money be transferred to his own bank in West Germany. No action was taken until October 23, 1954, when the Weimar Bank informed Wenck that he must take up the matter with the Ministry of Internal Affairs, District of Weimar. We have annulled your very old account, the bank's letter said, along with the interest accrued. In 5 great columns, the men of the 2nd Armoured Division sped toward the Elbe and Berlin. They passed lighted German headquarters without slowing their pace. They swept through towns where aged home guardsmen, guns in hand, stood helpless in the streets, too shocked to take action. They raced past German motorized columns moving out in the same direction. Guns blazed, but nobody stopped on either side. GIs riding on tanks took potshots at Germans on motorcycles. Where enemy troops tried to make a stand from dug-in positions, some US commanders used their armour-like cavalry. Major James F. Hollingsworth, coming upon one such situation, lined up 34 tanks and gave a command rarely heard in modern warfare. "Charge!" Guns roaring, Hollingsworth's tanks raced down toward the enemy positions, and the Germans broke and ran. Everywhere, tanks chewed through enemy positions and across enemy terrain. By Wednesday evening, April 11th, in an unparalleled armoured dash, the Shermans had covered 57 miles, 73 road miles, in just under 24 hours. Shortly after 8 p.m., Colonel Paul Disney flashed headquarters a laconic message: "We're on the Elbe." One small group of armoured vehicles had reached the outskirts of Magdeburg even earlier. In the afternoon, Lieutenant Colonel Wheeler Merriam's reconnaissance scout cars, travelling at speeds up to 55 miles per hour, dashed into a suburban area on the western bank of the Elbe. There the cars were stopped, not by German defences, but by civilian traffic and shoppers. The platoon let loose a high burst of machine gun fire to clear the streets. The result was chaos. Women fainted. Shoppers huddled in fearful groups or threw themselves flat on the ground. German soldiers ran helter-skelter, firing wildly. Merriam's group lacked the strength to hold the area, but scout cars managed to disentangle themselves and reach their objective, the airport. As they drove along the edge of the field, planes were landing and taking off. American guns began spraying everything in sight, including a squadron of fighters ready to take to the air. Then the defences rallied, and the platoon of scout cars was pinned down under heavy fire. The vehicles got out with the loss of only one armoured car, but their appearance had alerted Magdeburg's defenders. As one American unit after another reached the Elbe on either side of the city, they began to encounter increasingly stiffening resistance. Merriam's scouts, as they pulled back, reported one vital piece of information. The Autobahn bridge to the north of the city was still standing. This immediately became the division's prime objective, for it could carry the second to Berlin. But from the gunfire that met the Americans, it was clear that the bridge could not be taken on the run. Magdeburg's defenders were determined to fight. Meanwhile, there were other bridges to the north and south. If any one of these could be grabbed before the enemy destroyed it, the second would be on its way. 7 miles to the south, at Schönebeck, another bridge crossed the Elbe. It was the objective of Major Hollingsworth of the 67th Armoured Regiment. All through Wednesday afternoon, Hollingsworth's tanks raced unimpeded through town after town until they reached a place called Osterweg. There, a regiment of Home Guard units forced a halt in the advance. Hollingsworth was puzzled. Many of the elderly Germans seemed ready to surrender. Some had even tied handkerchiefs to their rifles and raised them above their foxholes, yet there was no let-up in the fighting. A prisoner, taken within the first few minutes, explained, 11 SS soldiers in the town were forcing the Home Guardsmen to fight. Angrily, Hollingsworth swung into action. Calling for his jeep and taking along an extra sergeant and a radio operator as well as the driver, the major circled the area and entered the town along a cowpath. He cut a strange figure. Twin Colt automatics were strapped low on his hips, Western style. For added measure, he carried a Tommy gun. Hollingsworth was a deadly shot who had personally killed over 150 Germans. Grabbing a passing civilian, he demanded to know where the SS troops were quartered. The terrified man immediately pointed to a large house and barn nearby, surrounded by a high fence. Noting a doorway in the fence, Hollingsworth and his men leapt from the car and, from a running start, smashed the door with their shoulders, ripping it off its hinges. As they crashed into the yard, an SS man rushed toward them, machine pistol raised. Hollingsworth riddled the man with his Tommy gun. The other 3 Americans began throwing grenades into the windows. Looking quickly about, the major spotted another SS man in the open hayloft doors of the barn and beat him to the drawer with his .45. Inside the buildings, they found the bodies of 6 grenade victims. The 3 other SS men surrendered. Hollingsworth rushed back to his column, having been held up for 45 precious minutes. 3 hours later, Hollingsworth's tanks breasted the high ground overlooking the towns of Schönebeck and Bad Salzselmen. Beyond, glittering in the early evening light, lay the Elbe, at this point almost 500 feet wide. As he surveyed the area through binoculars, Hollingsworth saw that the highway bridge was still standing, and with good reason. German armoured vehicles were using it to flee east across the river. How, Hollingsworth wondered, with enemy armour all around, could he grab the bridge before it was blown? As he watched, a plan began to form. Calling two of his company commanders, Captain James W. Starr and Captain Jack A. Knight, Hollingsworth outlined his idea. "They are moving along this north-to-south road, running into Bad Salzselmen," he said. "Then they swing east at the road junction, head into Schönebeck, and cross the bridge. Our only hope is to charge into Bad Salzselmen and grab the junction. Now here's what we'll do. When we get to the junction, your company, Starr, will peel off and block the road, holding the Germans coming up from the south. I'll join onto the rear of the German column that has already swung east into Schönebeck and follow it across the bridge. Knight, you come up behind. We've got to get that bridge, and by God, we're going to do it." Hollingsworth knew that the plan would work only if they could move fast enough. The light was fading. With luck, the German tanks would never know they had company behind them as they crossed the bridge. Within moments, Hollingsworth's tanks were on their way. Hatches buttoned up, they charged into Bad Salzselmen. Before the Germans were aware of what was happening, Starr's vehicles had blocked the road from the south and were engaging the line of panzers. The German tanks leading the column had already made the turn, heading for the bridge. Apparently hearing the sound of firing behind, they began to speed up. At that moment, Hollingsworth's tanks filled the gap in their column and followed along at the same speed. But then they were spotted. Artillery mounted on flat cars in the nearby railway yard opened fire on the rear of the US column. As Hollingsworth's Shermans turned into Schönebeck, a German Mark V tank, its turret revolving, drew a bead on the lead American. Staff Sergeant Cooley, Hollingsworth's gunner, opened fire and blew up the Mark V. Slewing sideways, the Panzer smashed into a wall and began burning furiously. There was barely room for Hollingsworth's tank to get by, but weaving ponderously, it edged through, followed by the rest of the column. Firing at the rear of each enemy vehicle and squeezing by the burning Panzers, the American tanks charged through the town. By the time they reached its centre, as Hollingsworth remembered, everyone was firing at everyone else. It was the damnedest mess. Germans were hanging out of windows, either shooting at us with their Panzerfauster or just dangling in death. Hollingsworth's tank had not been hit, and he was now only 3 or 4 blocks from the bridge. But the last stretch was the worst. As the remaining tanks pressed on, enemy fire seemed to come from everywhere. Buildings were blazing, and although by now it was 11 p.m., the scene was so brightly lit that it might still have been day. Ahead lay the approach to the bridge. The tanks rushed forward. The entrance, blocked from Hollingsworth's earlier view from the heights, was a maze of stone walls jutting out at irregular intervals from either side of the road. The vehicles had to slow and make sharp left and right manoeuvres before reaching the centre span.